A funny thing has happened to television over the last 30 years. With the rise in prestige narrative TV, followed by the fragmentation of streaming services, we also saw a steady decline in the number of episodes per season. Sci-fi fans these days have to hope that they'll get a good 10, maybe 15 episode run of their latest Star Trek melodrama or mind-twisting Netflix series. Though we know that we'll probably have to settle for closer to 8. There's a lot that goes into this, including the rise in the expected baseline quality of special effects, and the slow dialing up in the volume of negative discourse thanks to the internet. But the decline in episode numbers across most shows has put more weight on each individual episode to be better, especially since fans have ever more microscopes with which to examine these ever fewer moments of story. With the contraction of episode numbers and the general rise in quality of televised entertainment, we've seen the near complete death of the clip episode. A change which doesn't make me sad, even if Stargate produced some of the best ever episodes which followed the formula of let's shoot maybe 10 minutes of new material and repackage it with half an hour of old clips to meet our episode quota for this season without having to pay for a whole new story. What hasn't changed, though, is the need for filler episodes. Want to have every star of the ensemble cast and on screen for episode 1, 3, and 7? Well, we'd better make sure that we only put 3 of them in each of the other episodes. Do we want to have a really cool shootout on a space station with a mecha dragon and both ice and fire zombies in the final episode? Well, sounds like the penultimate one is going to all be set in that drab castle that we've used for exposition in every season of this show, and maybe 3 others as well. And those are just the budgetary reasons for filler. As a story, sometimes you need to have a linking chapter to nudge everyone into the right places and make sure that a story is appropriately set up for the big twist. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes those episodes can be the best and can do the most characterization work. They can reveal truths about a story that might otherwise get lost amidst the flurry of revelations and flash. Some of my favorite episodes of Westworld or House of the Dragon could have been audio dramas with hardly a change to the script. That's where Alan Wake Episode 3, Ransom, lands for me. It's got some of the best gameplay and most effective storytelling in the whole game. It takes me nearly twice as long to complete as the previous 2 episodes, even if I am surviving every encounter and not checking every dead end for manuscript pages or weapons stashes or pyramids of cans to shoot. The vast majority of the runtime of this episode is on-the-move gameplay that carries us from one of Alan's failed plans to the next, right up until the very end. A more accurate title for this episode could very well be Disappointment, or Let's Go to Plan C. As a work of gameplay and interactive narrative, it earns a passing grade from me all around, with a few small hiccups involving arena fights, cursed objects, and flashbangs still being better than the worst parts of most episodes. After meeting with the kidnapper in episode 2, Alan is resolved that he must write something to give to the man. He doesn't have a plan. He doesn't even know the plot of the story he's going to tell. And then there's the matter of supernatural interference on multiple fronts. Alan still feels a kind of magical writer's block anytime he sits down at the typewriter. Whenever he touches the keys, he's assaulted by headaches and visions of a woman in black. Meanwhile, that same woman appears to have taken over Rose, directing her to call Barry and claim that she has vital information which she will only share in person. Specifically, that she has the manuscript. Alan and Barry arrive at the Sparkling River Estates mobile home court amid a flurry of news and potential plot threads. Of course, there's the matter of Alan promising to bring a finished manuscript to the kidnapper by noon the next day, when he still can't write a word. Then the sheriff calls Alan to tell him that an FBI agent is in town looking to interview him, which Alan pushes off to later in the day. Barry has just spent the morning digging through the newspaper archives, reading all sorts of stories about the volcanic eruption at Cauldron Lake and the tangled relationship between Zane, Barbara Jagger, and the same Cynthia Weaver who wrote most of the articles which Barry found and who now haunts the town as the Lamp Lady, pointing out dead light bulbs everywhere she goes. According to Barry, the town of Bright Falls is no stranger to mysterious occurrences, including people disappearing in the night and more than your average number of ghost stories. Randy, the manager of the local trailer park and the proprietor of the hot dog stand, which was the first choice of all the taken in episode 1, is a God-fearing man who claims to not believe in most of the ghost stories. But he does share the story of Barbara Jagger and the scratching hag, saying that the local Native Americans considered Cauldron Lake to be a gateway to the underworld. Not that he believes that. Randy leaves Alan and Barry at Rose's trailer, where she greets them robotically and serves coffee laced with sleeping pills, apparently on orders from Barbara Jagger herself. Rose does not have the manuscript. She doesn't even remember why she invited Alan and Barry over, other than to see her favorite author and vaguely offer to be his muse so he can finish his work. This had been foreshadowed by the previous episode, as the closing cutscene showed an entranced Rose speaking to Barry, with the woman in black looming in the background. Alan slips into a drug-induced nightmare of the diver and the woman in black. Voices speak to him from the darkness, telling him to turn the lights on, to finish his work. These nightmares bleed into waking as Alan comes to consciousness in Rose's cotton candy pink bedroom, the small television on her dresser playing another vision of Alan, trapped in the writing room of Birdleg Cabin. I can't tell reality from dream anymore, the Alan on the TV says, neatly packaging one of the central conflicts of this whole episode. He goes on to describe Barbara Jagger, a woman in a black funeral dress who has become his imaginary editor as he struggles through the process of writing Departure. The edits are getting very aggressive, and each day there's less of me and more of her, he declares. So far, the television revelations have been either abstract moments of authorial terror, or perhaps metatextual commentary on how the designers felt while making the game. But this one fascinates me, because it both confirms some suspicions that I had at the beginning of the game, and raises new questions upon later playthroughs. As players and viewers, we are pretty sure what Alan is experiencing, and what is true, at least on a physical level. After all, we have pulled the trigger for him several hundred times by now. We've navigated the dark forest and gathered manuscript pages. But what to think about this revelation. And more importantly, its timing. As an external audience, we have seen references to Thomas Zane and Barbara Jagger scattered throughout the previous episodes. This vision confirms that Barbara is the woman in black who gave us the key to Birdleg Cabin. It even goes so far as having her remind Alan in this vision that she had told him that she would visit him and his wife on the island. This fits in with Barry's research, turning up the story of Barbara Jagger's death and adding the context of Cynthia Weaver not only being a local reporter, but someone deeply affected by Zane and Barbara's deaths. Everything seems to be fitting into place. Perhaps even a little too well. Because there is the matter of the timing of these revelations, which feels a little too convenient. If Alan is magically editing reality through the power of his writing, trying to pull Alice out of the dark place and save her by putting himself through a horror story populated by the people of Bright Falls, then all of this makes sense. And that's a big if. So, what if Alan is actually having a psychotic break, and Barry is just overreacting to a strange flock of birds on a stormy night in the wilderness? It's mighty convenient for Alan to suddenly dream about Thomas Zane trying to reach him underwater after learning that Zane was an avid diver whose lover drowned in Cauldron Lake. And how convenient that Alan gave the woman in black a name only after Barry told him about Barbara Jagger drowning in Cauldron Lake. It all fits together so neatly that you would be forgiven for thinking that the kidnappers, that's how the story goes, is just a little bit too applicable. Is this the episode in which events begin to connect because the story needs a linking episode? Or is this the moment when Alan goes completely off the deep end as he pulls more local names and legends into his own internalized narrative of madness? That's the glory of telling a horror story which blends the strange but natural and the supernatural. Like a well-constructed video game switching up combat scenarios and puzzle designs to keep players on their toes, a well-told story will often keep the audience in suspense, introducing new mysteries and challenges just as the old ones are resolved. It's the authorial version of empowerment and disempowerment, giving the audience just enough clues that they think that they've got it all figured out, then making them doubt the validity of some of those clues, and then dishing out a new, strange revelation to keep them doubting their own doubt. Taken too far, this can become as much of a repetitive mess as a series of boring wave defense fights or encounters with overpowered gimmick enemies. But when balanced with narrative tools like foreshadowing, dramatic irony, and a satisfying conclusion that ties up most of the loose ends, this is exactly the kind of uncertainty which keeps the audience playing to the very end. Alan arrives at the gates of the trailer park to discover that police cars are pulling into the parking lot. It's implied, but never directly stated, that Randy has called the law, concerned that two strangers are still in Rose's trailer. This implication is important to note, because it's the first of several times in this episode when Alan's plans will fall through just due to an inconvenience of timing. As I joked at the beginning of this episode's analysis, this part of the story runs on failed plans. Agent Nightingale leaps out of his car, gun drawn, shouting for Alan to surrender, then giving him no time to respond before opening fire. Not that Alan could even be sure who Nightingale was threatening, because the outraged FBI agent doesn't call him by name. This becomes something of a running gag throughout the story, as Nightingale frequently calls Alan by the names of other authors, from the much-referenced Stephen King to Ernest Hemingway, as well as many now-forgotten crime writers who were bestsellers in their day. We get only a brief glimpse of Nightingale on screen, as the action quickly shifts to a chase sequence. But for all its sketchy imperfection, the first impression we get of his character is clear. Nightingale is a loose cannon with a personal vendetta against Alan Wake. This is where the game performs one of its more successful thematic inversions. We've been conditioned by now to look for light in the game world because the lamps and generators scattered around the map serve as save points, safe points, healing stations, all rolled into one. That familiar pattern will return soon, but for now we are forced to run from shadow to shadow down a series of gullies as members of the Bright Falls Sheriff Department shine searchlights across the landscape. Light has gone from being our haven to serving as a tool of our enemies. Darkness is now Alan's shelter against wild gunshots from the pursuing deputies. There's even a helicopter chase, which forces us to hide behind rocks and scurry along the narrow mountain trails. It's all delightfully chaotic and nonsensical in the manner of escape sequences in crime thrillers and action movies. And then the dark presence shows up. Suddenly, police cars are tumbling across the screen, and a tornado of darkness strikes the helicopter to Earth with a fiery explosion. All the while, we hear the police shouting in confusion and arguing with Agent Nightingale over the radio. It doesn't have to make perfect sense, because as the kidnapper told us, this is a story. Nightingale himself isn't even an active-duty FBI agent, having been fired in the backstory to the game. This is not well explained during the narrative of Alan Wake itself, which briefly portrays him as an unhinged drunk, but his downfall is explored in greater depth in the external media like the Alan Wake Files, that tie-in book credited to Clay Stewart. Even there, though, not everything is explained. I'm tempted to invoke the poetry of fear again here, but I believe it has more to do with Alan's casual and, to some degree, unintentional manipulation of the lives of others through the manuscript of departure. In the chaos of the moment, with the deputies of Bright Falls assigned to help Nightingale, the point is to separate Alan from Barry while injecting action into the plot. As a narrative, this creates a new set of challenges for Alan to overcome, which is important in the context of the manuscript because stories must follow their own internal logic. They must contain drama, escalating challenges, and small glimmers of hope for the protagonist to strive towards. Make it too easy, and the same rules you're bending for the protagonist become flexible for the antagonist as well. In a novel, this often means lots of carefully balanced conversation, scene descriptions, depictions of action, and internal monologues, as all of the pieces are shuffled into place. Television and film will often mix action scenes with moments of characters talking while catching their breath or riding in a vehicle. In a video game, this sets players loose on a series of traversal and combat encounters, using that common language of violence often shared by films, television shows, books, theater performances, rock music, and Of course, video games. Used to bridge the gap between narrative and gameplay. Violence begets violence, but it's also one of the easiest ways to keep the audience engaged. Twists, reversals, iterations, taking what we know about the game or story and adding a new facet or layer to it, making us think about how the rules apply and where the loopholes might be. These are the tools which authors, filmmakers, and game makers employ to bring their stories to life. Take, for example, the conversation we can overhear on the police radio as Thornton and Mulligan report on taking Rose and Barry into custody. So far in the game, everyone who has been touched by the dark presence has been killed or worse. Rose, however, is just being plain weird. According to a page we find, Barbara Jagger touched Rose's face and reached into her mind, twisting her will to lure Alan and Barry to her. Touched, but not taken. Is there a fundamental difference between being touched by the darkness and being taken by it? Is Alan merely having mercy on Rose in the manuscript of departure? Some questions remain unanswered, in fiction as in real life. But by bringing them up, the author adds texture to the story and depth to the characters. Too many questions or contradictions, and the story begins to unravel. The characters begin to feel unsteady. The world even starts to lose coherence. As the light shining in the darkness, revealing the truth of the story for the reader one small piece at a time, storytellers of all mediums have a tremendous responsibility to keep their audience hooked while allowing the story to grow in a way which feels far more natural than it actually is. The constraints, the hidden limits of the story act in harmony with good level design to draw the audience along the intended path without making the borders and invisible walls too obvious. Once we've escaped the police, light and dark revert to their expected roles, with the flashlight becoming even more important due to the game introducing objects which are possessed by the darkness. We've seen the dark presence fling debris at Alan before. During the running escape sequence, it threw police cars and crashed a helicopter. But as the wind settles and the pacing returns to a familiar rhythm of traveling through the forest and fighting taken along the trail, we find our path blocked by gates, wreathed in darkness that will not open until we burn away the shadows with light. The first of these is handled with an old spotlight attached to a cantankerous generator, creating one of the few timed traversal puzzles in the game. Just a little ways on down the path, the wooden gates which we must burn past with the flashlight prove no threat, but are a hint that we will be using our flashlight for more than picking out traps and removing enemy shields moving forward. It's when the game begins to throw haunted objects at us that the flashlight becomes our most important weapon for much of the Ransom episode. Old cars, wire spools, chunks of metal, even whole locomotives and train cars. The dark presence permeates everything we encounter, filling seemingly random junk with malevolent intent and just enough motive force to become deadly. There are moments in episode 3 where the only way to survive is to keep a tree or a corner of a building between you and the cursed items as they rise steadily into the air, quivering with barely restrained violence, and then suddenly hurl themselves at Alan. There's an intensity necessary to survive in Episode 3. Players must guide Alan with a degree of confidence that feels a little out of sync with his dialogue and the words on the manuscript pages. In ransoming his wife with nothing but his own determination, Alan becomes a full self-insert action hero over the course of these 2 nights, at least as far as his body and imagination permit. Last episode, we had a section which disempowered the player by giving them only road flares. This time, we get to play with a different set of combat tools in the shape of flashbangs taken from a wrecked police car. I'm less impressed with the flashbangs than the flare gun, or even the road flares. Sure, they give a bright flash of light that annihilates Taken's shields and shatters their bodies. But they're also hard to aim, and like grenades in many video games, I often feel like they're both overly safe for the player to use and overpowered against enemies. They prove essential, however, during a couple of long stretches when we must hurry through the forest, balancing the relentless drive to move forward with the necessity of taking it slow so we don't summon too many Taken from the shadows at once. Alan has got it in his head that Pat Maine may be able to help him. This feels less like an actual hope, and more like a wish. But Pat has been introduced as a character in the game, so of course Alan is going to use him as a character in his own story. Alan, as the author of Departure, seems unsure of how to use Pat, though, because the moment that Alan, the hero of Alan Wake Remastered, steps into Pat's radio studio, Agent Nightingale shows up and begins shooting. Just like the police pulling into the mobile home park as Alan approached the front gate, Agent Nightingale arrives beneath the sign for 97.6 KBF FM the instant Pat Maine announces that Alan has arrived in the studio. Pat and Alan don't even have time to exchange greetings before blue and red lights are flashing through the window and Agent Nightingale is pulling his weapon. This is one of those moments in Alan Wake when we have to accept that the game is, at times, painfully inconsistent in its pacing. The question which lingers in my mind, however, is how much of that awkward pacing is intentional, as a metafictional portrayal of Alan being rushed through writing Departure. That certainly fits what we've learned so far about Alan and his mysteriously pushy editor, but the pacing issues could equally be the result of Remedy biting off more than they could chew as they tried to push the art of video games forward. Alan, as an author, knows that he needs a chase, and that the odds need to be stacked against his protagonist. He introduces an FBI agent to up the stakes, but isn't invested in fleshing out that character as anything more than an irritant. So what does Alan do? He writes Nightingale as a drunken loose cannon who repeatedly arrives out of nowhere just to prevent a clean resolution and force Alan back onto his journey through the darkness. It's sloppy, hackneyed writing and makes for uneven pacing, but we need to keep driving the action forward. Did Remedy intend for us to pick up on these artistic subtleties? More to the point, when you're adapting the genre of psychological action thrillers to a video game, do you have to include the flaws as well as the good parts? Just because many a film, TV show, or popular novel has descended into the protagonist fighting monsters in the dark, a developer isn't bound to adapt those cheap thrills into their own game. To all accounts, Alan Wake was one of those projects where the company spent years building an engine and world and characters, and then had to rush to get the actual game out the door before money ran out and contracts came due. Whole plot beats and levels were thrown away entirely or cannibalized to make new consolidated versions once Remedy switched from an open world to a linear story. There's a lot of complicated storytelling and deep artistic merit to Alan Wake. But saying Alan is a hack writer in a hurry, so departure is messy, isn't an excuse for the game itself often feeling like it's pulling the rug out from under us time and again. I do, however, think that a lot of the point of Episode 3 is to keep the action moving and get us through a bit of a rough spot in the story and on to the next important revelation. Alan the hero doesn't have a clear plan and is running on instincts. Remedy has a plan, but needs to get both the players and Alan from believing that Alice has been kidnapped to thinking Alice is trapped in the dark place. And they need to do this as effectively as possible while still creating a fun experience. As for Alan the writer, he is struggling to get back into the flow of storytelling, even as a dark editorial force continually shifts the tone of his narrative towards a horror story. The result is a game, and an episode within that game, which embodies the very tropes that it is nodding towards. Whether this is a strength or a flaw in the game is up to the individual player to decide, especially when we approach the game more than a decade after the release of the Remastered edition. Having spent approximately 10 seconds actually talking with Pat Main before leaping off of a deck and disappearing into the woods again, Alan must make his way to a railway depot where he hopes to find a car to steal. And the police aren't even pursuing him this time, thanks to Sheriff Breaker showing up and shouting down Nightingale when he starts shooting. We've actually reached that level of an action novel self-insert plot. Alan's plan is a bad plan, but given that the alternative seems to be getting shot by a rogue FBI agent, it's the one we go with. This is far from the worst choice that Alan makes over the course of the story, but it's certainly up there on his list of poor decisions and contrived plot points. With the story firmly in linking episode territory, and what little plan Alan might have had before now in shambles, it's time to send our hero back into the meat grinder. Almost literally, it turns out, as haunted objects will prove at least as dangerous as Taken for the remainder of this episode. Work lights, flashbangs, flares, and guns will all prove necessary to keep the enemy at bay. Flashlights, and our more explosive light sources, will be especially important when crossing the train trestle, as the clutter of cursed junk proves itself lethal if we don't continually press forward and get through the danger zone before all of the shadowy objects have a chance to disentangle themselves and attack Alan. One obviously telegraphed arena fight, and a jump scare later, and we'll be facing the only real boss battle of this night. A bulldozer. Seriously, right before the bulldozer fight, the game tries to distract us from the silliness of it all by offering a Night Springs episode which combines Lovecraftian monster names, a G-rated succubus, and a plot reminiscent of Alan's own arrival in a small town with secrets. It's all reminiscent of old horror movies and public domain horror novels, as much as it is of the Twilight Zone. I bring this up now because the Eldritch infection will prove important to the narrative moving forward. But it's also easy to forget because the moment we move on from the office, we are going to end this night by fighting a giant bulldozer. It's dumb and stupidly frustrating until you realize that the entire fight inverts the usual mechanics of taking down the ads first, followed by the big boss. In this case, the boss is a bulldozer that will take you to almost 0 health on a single hit. So the only workable strategy that I have found is to keep moving and keep your flashlight powered up and focused on the dozer until it shatters. And then you can clean up the taken. As a more active means of inverting the usual power dynamic of a boss fight, I do like this. But there's little to no foreshadowing that we need to focus on the haunted bulldozer over the taken mobs, so the learning curve to figuring that out is quite steep. It also forces attention onto the single most gamey mechanic in Alan Wake: batteries. As I discussed in my lengthy video on the tutorial dream sequence, the flashlight is probably my favorite part of Alan Wake's combat mechanics. Shields for players and enemies alike is nothing new in video games. I can remember scouring levels of Wolfenstein 3D or Dark Forces for armor boosts to hold back the pixelated forces of evil. But the requirement of burning the darkness away not only humanizes our opponents while slowing the pace of combat, but also gives Alan Wake some unique crowd control mechanics. Like taking a human shield in the Splinter Cell games, using the boosted flashlight against the Taken after their shields are burned away allows players to temporarily slow the advance of enemies, which would otherwise just mob them. The flashlight doesn't work like that against haunted objects, especially the bulldozer or later encounters against locomotives and rail cars. You have to keep the light fixed on the object, pressing the boost button while trying to keep something solid between Alan and the haunted machine, because inevitably it will launch itself towards him at least once before you manage to destroy it. Equally inevitably, you'll have to swap out batteries, a task which happens nearly instantly, and without any disruption to the light. I don't know that the game would play better if changing the batteries were slower and caused the light to go out for a few seconds, but it would take what feels like a gimmick and make it feel more realistic, while ramping up the tension even more. In one recent playthrough, I burned through 4 flares and 6 flashlight charges to take down the bulldozer. It wasn't especially difficult. Combat difficulty in Alan Wake is generally more of a function of encounter gimmicks and struggling with the camera than the actual fight itself. It didn't take very long. As my footage shows, the total time between the bulldozer crashing through a log pile and dissolving into fragments of light and shadow is about 50 seconds. And that is the challenge of being a storyteller or a game designer. You have to work really hard to make it all feel effortless, or at least right. I do admire the designers for trying to shake things up. The haunted objects are universally annoying to fight, both on this night and in the very next nighttime sequence we're about to head into, but they are presented in a way which breaks up the by now familiar patterns of fighting groups of Taken. If the goal of Episode 3 is to connect major story moments while experimenting with already established gameplay formula, the designers certainly accomplished most of their goals. Which is more than we can say for the version of Alan who has become an action hero, because he is mostly stuck in limbo for the runtime of Episode 3. After finding an unlocked power company truck on the far side of the bulldozer fight, and driving the back roads of Bright Falls until morning, players are tasked with driving to an old mine where Alan is supposed to meet the kidnapper. He doesn't have a completed manuscript. He doesn't have any backup. The police are looking for him. They have Barry in custody. They're watching Pat Maine. So Alan is going into this dangerous negotiation completely unsupported. It's about as good a plan as the plot of your average clip show episode, and continues to serve the narrative purpose of getting us to Alan's next encounter with the kidnapper. This brief daylight sequence gives us a tour of the region and allows a few moments of character development if players get out of the car to explore the shacks and fire watchtowers we passed along the road to the coal mine. I enjoy the driving mechanics in Alan Wake, as simple as they are, and found this passage to be a nice opportunity to appreciate the map design without the constant irritation of fighting Taken. Still, this is definitively more of a mood and story moment than a difficult gameplay challenge. The road is easy to follow. The couple of places you can get out of the car and listen to a radio broadcast from Pat Maine are easy to find. There aren't really any side paths to explore, unless you count getting out of the car to find the occasional thermos or red wingback chair scattered throughout the forest. You get in the car with Alan, and for somewhere around 10 minutes, you explore the beauty of a simulated Pacific Northwest, perhaps pausing in places to take in the scenery or listen to the radio, though Alan never turns on the car radio while driving. It doesn't feel like wasted time. In fact, I really enjoy the opportunity to sightsee. Alan Wake Remastered is a beautiful game, and my least favorite part is being unable to roam freely around this quirky town. Moments like this, or the ferry and diner sequences in Episode 1, give me a sense of existing in a game world, rather than merely passing through it on my way to the next combat encounter or weird puzzle. Alan himself isn't merely a one-man army destroying the powers of darkness. He is a human. He is uncertain. If he succeeds in his mission to rescue Alice, he'll still have to live with himself and learn to write again. Taking the time to breathe mid-episode is a reward, an incentive, and a warning all wrapped up in one long-range vehicular traversal level. We talked before about empowerment versus disempowerment in game design. After fighting through escalating waves of Taken and haunted objects, this daylight segment serves as a natural reset of the power curve, giving players time to settle from the frustration or excitement of the bulldozer fight, even as it gives Alan time to become angry again. Oh, and angry he'll be when the kidnapper fails to arrive for their noon meeting. Alan stays at the mine, waiting for the kidnapper for hours until dark. His choice to remain at the old mine appears almost as silly as the bulldozer fight at first glance, but with all of Alan's allies captured or under observation, and Nightingale clearly more interested in shooting than listening, what else is he going to do? This hours-long wait is probably the weakest part of the story for me, but I understand what the developers are attempting to get across. He's unable to write, powerless to get Alice from the kidnapper, and unwilling to trust anyone. What else is he going to do but wait at an old coal mine museum until the kidnapper shows up, or Barry manages to get out of jail and call him? Alan has written himself into a corner, and now has to find his way out of it. That escape will come with darkness, as the kidnapper calls and summons Alan to meet him at Mirror Peak, thus setting into motion the second nighttime sequence of Episode 3. This time, the game is going to begin mixing up combat mechanics and puzzles immediately, providing an experience which is both a retread of the night before and a fun tour of all of the game's systems. We fight Taken. We fight haunted objects. We navigate mazes built from old railway cars. One of the more clever moments sees Alan dropping a flashbang or flare through the roof hatch of a railway car to destroy the haunted object that would otherwise do a lot of damage if we try and jump straight down and destroy it with a flashlight. The developers also lean into the now practiced driving mechanics by presenting a combined puzzle and combat sequence that requires players to drive across a wide space populated by taken and haunted equipment, running enemies over with the car and using its headlights to destroy shadow-wreathed objects before they fling themselves at the car and crumple it into a smoking wreck. The challenge of writing about this night is that there is little wrong with this level, other than the continued oddity of burning through batteries to fight haunted objects. It's a pure navigation and combat challenge, with the designers continuing to iterate on previous systems and layer them together into a mostly fun experience. The level even manages to use the cinematic camera well in a moment when Alan reaches the end of a tense jog through the forest and is attacked by 5 taken at once. They all start far enough away that, assuming we use the work lamps and have some spare flares, the fight is a fun reward for running from lamp to lamp, staying ahead of the monsters that kept rushing at Alan from the windswept trees. I would have similarly glowing words for the atmosphere of the old graveyard which Alan passes through as we climb towards the abandoned mining town of Grey Peak Gorge, if it didn't use the fast, semi-invisible taken. On my first playthrough, my least favorite enemy type was the axe-throwing taken. But by my third time through the game, I'd learned to keep them at bay and interrupt their throws with a focused flashlight. The fast-moving taken are just annoying. Camera controls are barely acceptable in Alan Wake, and invisible enemies are challenging in the best of games. So fighting fast-moving enemies who are initially nothing but a ripple in your vision in an already dark scene using a weird camera does a lot to degrade the creepy atmosphere of the graveyard. I've already had a lot to say about haunted objects in the Ransom episode. From gates to girders to bulldozers, the primary challenge of this episode has come from the proliferation of animated junk attacking the player and requiring shifts in combat technique. Grey Peak Gorge is littered with automobiles and train cars infused with the dark presence. Some of these cursed objects strike hard enough to kill Alan in a single direct blow, as is appropriate for a literal steam engine hitting the player character in the face. I also find these to be some of the most frustrating encounters in the episode, resulting in the most gamey interactions, as it's often necessary to hide behind a chunk of broken wall, or the rotting support post of an old water tower, or perhaps a very small tree, while burning away the darkness infusing a rusty old coal transport. Most of the haunted objects are large enough that they'll require several batteries to destroy, and have sufficient time to launch themselves at Alan at least twice before they dissolve into shards of golden light. If it wasn't gamey enough to be continually shoving batteries into the flashlight while counting the seconds before a glitched out 3D asset tumbles wildly towards you, The sight of it slamming to a stop harmlessly against a rotten old timber and then juddering between two scrawny pine trees is both funny and quite immersion-breaking. The haunted objects are used effectively in some moments. The dark presence throwing rail cars around to change the map feels menacing and pushes the player down the intended path while adding a bit of tension to long moments of travel through the abandoned industrial settings. It's when the objects multiply and become enemies that they often lose their eeriness and become merely frustrating. Arriving at an old shack that has recently been occupied, Alan encounters the next of the mysterious televisions which serve as windows into the week he lost. On this one, the trapped version of Alan confesses that anything outside of writing is a struggle. He's stuck in the cabin, in the darkness. He can do nothing but write and revise, and occasionally break away from the typewriter to obsessively read books by Thomas Zane, which he found in a shoebox downstairs. And this is where we get our first indication of the truth behind how this spiraling story may have begun. Assuming, of course, that any version of this story is entirely true. Zane was an artist in the broad sense of the word. He wrote stories, poems, and films. We already know that he was inspired by, or perhaps obsessed with, a young woman named Barbara Jagger. Now, we learn that he also believed that Cauldron Lake itself emanated a magical force. A dark magic, which drove the men who created in its vicinity to conjure forth demons which could both inspire and corrupt in equal measure. He also began to believe that the darkness had taken over his girlfriend. The horrific things which Zane would come to do remain only implied for now, but the version of Alan in the television invokes the name of Lovecraft to describe the monsters which Zane believed might lurk on the other side of the dark waters of Cauldron Lake. Remember that local legend and newspaper clippings alike confirmed that Barbara Jagger drowned in 1970, the same year that a minor volcanic eruption caused Diver's Isle to sink into the lake. According to a sign back in the coal mine museum, 32 miners died when the tunnels collapsed due to the eruption, and all of the mines in and around Bright Falls were shut down. With Thomas Zane missing and Barbara Jagger dead, Cynthia Weaver began writing outlandish tales for the newspaper and slowly descended into her own obsession with pushing back the darkness. As a linking narrative, Episode 3 is continuing to gather up all of the loose plot threads and bring them together in a single story that theoretically makes sense. From shaking up the combat with cursed objects and mostly well-structured Taken encounters, to giving players exactly the manuscript pages, TV shows, and radio interviews which they need to begin connecting the dots, this third episode of Alan Wake does some of the strongest work at allowing players to experience the story of the game. It's a bit short on cutscenes, and those which exist primarily serve to repeatedly pull the rug out from under players, but the overall combination of narrative and gameplay reaches a new high point in this episode. Even the birds are used in a manner which feels nearly perfect, though a cinematic camera does manage to be a hindrance when fighting them. As Alan makes his way up a twisting cliffside path where players must navigate precisely and do some easy platforming between makeshift bridges, the ravens begin swarming him. There are just a few groups, and they are easily dispatched with a flare or can be ignored and outrun. That, I believe, is the point of them in this scene. Like the rushing wind, the ravens here serve as impetus for Alan to hurry along the cliff face until we fall through some rotting boards and end up in the abandoned silver mine at the far end of the trail. Using the ravens not as a swarming enemy type that we must whittle down to a non-zero number before the story can progress, but as a driving force that pushes Alan to the next plot location feels far more appropriate to their overall design. Of all of the times we encounter birds in Alan Wake, this mountain path, and an earlier optional encounter which takes place while returning from the radio tower, are the best use of them in the game. If this scene clearly indicated that running is the best option by unleashing streamers of dark wind, or merely didn't steal the camera away to show the bird's perspective, it would be one of the best moments in the episode. The silver mine itself is a thoroughly serviceable return to tight corridors and mini-arena fights against mixed groups of Taken. It's also a bit of a wasted opportunity if we're going to get picky. Whether for lore reasons, development resources, or whatever else, the Taken we encounter in the mine are merely repetitions of the sort we have fought throughout the forest and the ghost town. Given the aforementioned history of 32 men dying in the mines back in 1970, this would have been a perfect opportunity to shift to pickaxe-wielding Taken or more distorted forms inspired by the mining disaster. Still, it's a serviceable passage which provides just enough of a navigation challenge without falling into the trap of making the mines into an actual maze. The only significant false path in the mines leads down to a flooded tunnel where Alan will experience a vision of Alice and Barbara Jagger and find another manuscript page. The most maze-like element is really a brief puzzle in which we have to navigate a series of ladders and repeatedly move a bundle of girders hanging from a crane to reach 3 different control boxes and make our way to the top. As a navigation puzzle, it requires just a bit of pre-planning and backtracking, creating a comfortable brain teaser amid all of this walking and shooting. It fits the setting perfectly, and provides a break from the combat challenges while engaging the player's puzzle-solving skills. Having already complimented the game's use of birds along the narrow path to the silver mine, I won't complain too bitterly about yet another gondola sequence, except to point out that Alan Wake yet again destroys a cable car merely by riding it. I don't know what the designers at Remedy have against cable cars, but so far we're 2 for 2 with birds attacking and the whole thing collapsing. Once is a dramatic moment. Twice is beginning to establish a pattern. And according to Alan Wake Illuminated, there was originally going to be an entire chapter of the game set during a forest fire, which would have culminated in even more gondola escapes. But that whole part was cut from the game, and the question of whether we were spared further collapses will never be answered. There is also a nicely designed fight on a long wood and rope suspension bridge, which includes one of the better uses of the cinematic camera in the game. Rather than forcing players to look at an already obvious objective, or pulling control away at a key moment to highlight an enemy's arrival, the opening of the bridge fight sees the camera cutting away to a wide view, which clearly shows the Taken closing in at either side of the bridge, before handing control back to the player, with plenty of time to pop a flare and hold the rearward enemy at bay. It's easy enough then to aim Alan's flashlight at the forward two while they are still lurching across the unsteady bridge, and win the fight. in a few decisive shots. The game also manages to make use of destroyable environments, although they are inconsistently deployed, even in this episode. We occasionally have to push and kick some boards as we ascend the final section of the mountain, creating bridges and lowering ramps. These interactions are nothing revolutionary, even for the time the game originally came out, and one is left wondering how the kidnapper managed to pass through this region ahead of Alan with so many obstacles in his path. Of course, he could have taken an easier route, seeing as he didn't have to walk all this way from the old mine museum. Still, if Alan is the hero of this story, and the hero must face challenges to reach his destination, these are more the sort of basic adventure game obstacles which Alan may well have dreamed up while writing alone in the dark place. The final fight of this night is relatively easy, and honestly carries more weight as a narrative device than a boss encounter. After surviving a fall from a collapsing roof, we fight 7 Taken in a dilapidated brick house right before the Mirror Peak overlook. This house is important less for its combat encounter, which is as competently paced as its setting is a little silly, and more because of what we find in the basement. Since the first night, Alan has been finding eerie graffiti which showed up only under a flashlight beam, and always directs the player to hidden boxes filled with batteries, weapons, and ammunition. In Episode 2, those boxes became even more important, as they proved to be the most prolific source of ammunition and flares, making the game significantly easier. Here in Episode 3, those caches continue to prove useful, and in keeping in the theme of this episode, they've been subtly tweaked to provide both more narrative hints and more of a mechanical challenge. First, there was a trapped shotgun leaning against a table in a dilapidated cabin we pass on the first night, which causes a bunch of Taken to spawn the moment Alan picks it up. Then, some caches turned out to also have a generator nearby, allowing players to save their progress halfway between 2 distant light sources. Other caches proved to give only a minor advantage, as the path returning from the supply box was guarded by multiple fast or heavy Taken, whose arrival chews through about half of the supplies which Alan just picked up, as players fight their way back to the main path. And now we find something more. The basement of the brick house is splattered with raving messages and many repetitions of Tom's name. "I curse you," Thomas Zane is prominent among them, though for every invective against him, another message reads, "I miss you. You talk to me on TV. Did you write this?" Or even a simple heart with the initials TZ and CW. Though the game doesn't explicitly tell us during this episode, it's not hard to infer that these messages might have been written by Cynthia Weaver. Like her, the words painted throughout Elderwood National Park are obsessed with light and darkness. Barry and Randy both confirmed that Cynthia had a breakdown after Thomas Zane and Barbara Jagger disappeared, and it stands to reason that if the TZ plus BJ initials on the diver's aisle stump referred to the artist and his muse who died when the darkness took her, then the TZ plus CW initials here must refer to the third member of their tight-knit group, the one who was betrayed and broken by the terrible events which occurred back in 1970. If the dark place takes an artistic impulse and twists it, allowing artists like Alan and Tom to rewrite reality by tapping into some sort of cosmic entity that dwells in Cauldron Lake, then what kind of terrible effect might it have on the relationship between Thomas Zane, Barbara Jagger, and Cynthia Weaver, as it turns creativity into destruction? Might it turn love into obsession? Had the dark presence actually taken Barbara Jagger as the version of Alan on the television described reading in Thomas Zane's shoebox poems? And whether or not Cynthia Weaver is the CW of the paint, can we continue to trust the yellow-painted graffiti which leads us to the extra supplies, with how often Taken seem to be haunting those caches now? The purpose of Episode 3 is to serve as an extended linking passage, which iterates on the already established story beats and game mechanics to set things up for the next major twist in the narrative. Sometimes those are the hardest parts to write, because, as Alan repeatedly tells us, a story has a mind of its own and must follow its own internal rules. Skip too much time, strain credulity too far, or meander off from the plot too many times, and you'll lose the audience. Alan Wake Remastered certainly struggles to hold its plot and gameplay together in many places, but for all my nitpicking, I genuinely enjoy playing Chapter 3 as an interactive story and entertaining series of combat puzzles. As much as fighting the haunted objects can be an exercise in comic frustration, and the cutscenes are uniformly silly with their sudden arrivals and narrow escapes, the moment-to-moment experience of playing this episode is some of the best gameplay in Alan Wake Remastered. It begins with the unexpected appearance of a boat in the middle of the Sparkling River Estates trailer park, which foreshadows the game's reliance on haunted objects for the rest of this chapter. It continues with those extra Taken attacking us after raiding a supply cache or 3. Each detail of the story in this chapter has been chosen to make us question our expectations. It's messy. The Alan in the television knows that he can only push things so far towards his goal, or the story will turn against him. And let's not forget that he has a harsh editor looming over his shoulder, one who seeks to create something as glorious and terrible through Alan's work as the followers of that Lovecraftian worm Nixie Perka did in Night Springs. Returning to the house where we found all of that unnerving graffiti, think about the initials again. TZ and CW in a heart. If this is actually Cynthia Weaver, then it implies that she is both our mysterious benefactor and more involved in the story of Thomas Zane and Barbara Jagger than we initially suspected. If she is still obsessed with Thomas Zane and still thinks that he talks to her from the television, can we actually trust her? This narrative uncertainty surrounding Cynthia is foreshadowed by the increased mechanical uncertainty surrounding the supplies that she has been leaving for us. This very house both gives us extra supplies and hosts a rather large Taken attack when Alan tries to cross the roof. Similarly to how we had to stay out of the police searchlights at the beginning of Ransom, which briefly inverted our relationship between light and safety, as it had been established during the previous 2 episodes. Now the developers are trying to imply that Cynthia Weaver may not be as harmless as we first thought, by adding both an unsettling story element and a combat consequence to some of her supply caches. Escaping from the ambush in the brick house, Alan approaches the Mirror Peak lookout, and Episode 3's final twist. Turning a corner, we can hear the kidnapper call out. Alan shouts back, and we can choose to hurry down the path, but it quickly becomes clear that the kidnapper is talking to somebody else. To a woman. And she is angry. It turns out that the kidnapper is not actually a kidnapper. He and his as yet unnamed boss only pretended to have Alice to manipulate Alan into giving them the finished manuscript. The game never explicitly says how Mott got Alice's license, but the same manuscript page which gives his name also describes him finding the Wake's car parked near the sunken diver's aisle. My pet theory is that Alice had left her license in the car, but we don't have to fully explain every plot detail for the story to fit. And who is this on the Overlook platform with Mott, the not kidnapper? None other than the scratching hag, the woman in black, Barbara Jagger herself. Or at least the dark presence wearing her face, projecting itself through and around her. Before Alan can even speak with Mott, the whirlwind lifts both men and hurls them off of the cliff. Alan clings to a flare as he falls, tracing a path of smoke and fire through the night, until he strikes the dark water. And a hand reaches down to lift him out. This final twist recontextualizes everything we have done in episodes 2 and 3. No wonder the kidnapper was jerking Alan around, speaking in grandiose phrases about knowing how the story would go, but never giving any concrete proof that he had Alice alive. For all its flaws, this third episode of Alan Wake successfully untangles most of the plot threads left dangling in the first 2 parts, and weaves them into a new tapestry of fear. And it's in the next episode that we will learn the truth. Thank you for joining me today for this exploration of Episode 3 of Alan Wake Remastered, Ransom. I'm Andrew Link. If you enjoy these sorts of deep dives and potentially slightly overwrought analyses of video games, films, and other forms of literature, then I'd encourage you to give this video a like and subscribe. Maybe share it with everybody you know who likes this sort of thing. I'm trying out a few different formats with my videos over the next couple of months, so I'm excited to see which of the several styles I'm trying gets more reactions and more comments. So, if you have any thoughts about Episode 3 of Alan Wake, in particular, any theories involving the residents of those graveyards, please take a moment and leave some comments down below.